The soft chime of the doorbell echoed faintly as Elliot Crane stepped into what once felt like an extension of his soul. 2 decades ago, he had poured every ounce of his heart into this place, fork and flame. He remembered the long nights painting these very walls, choosing each chair not just for comfort but for how it made people linger, and personally installing the vintage brass light fixtures that still dangled from the ceiling like suspended memory. But now, at 59, Elliot stood in the entrance of his original location and felt like an outsider in his own story, a ghost in the house he built. He had deliberately stepped away from the spotlight 5 years earlier. His face had disappeared from marketing materials, and his name had gradually been removed from plaques and press releases. Most of the staff wouldn't recognize him if he were serving their table, and that anonymity had become more than just convenient. It had become vital, because lately, Elliot had started hearing whispers, rumors of a slow rot creeping through his beloved restaurant chain. Toxic culture, fear-driven management. A place once built on love and human connection, now reportedly ruled by intimidation. Dressed in worn jeans and a hoodie that had seen years of service fixing broken freezers and leaky sinks, Elliot didn't come to play the part of a CEO today. He came to listen, to observe. His scarred hands tucked into his pockets as he scanned the dining room. The air felt thick, heavy with something unspoken. There was no music. No laughter. Servers moved briskly, their shoulders slightly hunched, their smiles brittle and fading at the edges. This wasn't the warm hum of community he had once nurtured. It felt more like the sterile tension of a courtroom. A voice shattered his reflection like glass breaking in a quiet room. "Yeah? What do you want?" It was clipped, harsh. Elliot turned to see a tall, sharply dressed man striding toward him with the kind of swagger that reeked of unchecked authority. Late 20s, maybe. His name tag read, Jake Monroe, manager, and every inch of his body language screamed control, dominance, insecurity dressed up as leadership. "I'd like a booth," Elliot said evenly, gesturing toward the cozy corner he had once considered the heart of the restaurant. It was where birthday cakes were sliced, proposals whispered, where the memories of his customers lingered like perfume in the upholstery. Jake's eyes flicked over Elliot's modest attire. No brand names, no watch, no sign of wealth, with visible contempt. "Booths for one?" he scoffed. "What is this, a library? There's a coffee shop down the street if you're planning to camp out all day." The words landed like a slap. But Elliot didn't flinch. He had been laughed at, underestimated, even humiliated in the early days of building his empire from scratch. But this arrogance was different. It wasn't about him. It was about what his dream had become in the wrong hands. "The bar will do just fine," Elliot replied, his voice calm but edged with resolve. He wasn't here to fight. Not yet. He needed to see more, feel more. There would be time for confrontation later. Right now, he had to understand how far the rot had spread. Jake gestured lazily toward the bar without another glance. "Whatever, Mayo will get you sorted." Then, without missing a beat, he turned and barked at a server helping an elderly couple, disrupting their peaceful moment with his booming commands. Elliot slipped onto a stool at the bar, eyes scanning the restaurant like a captain surveying a stormy sea. It didn't take long to see the cracks. Jake moved like a predator, never walking, always prowling. His presence alone was enough to stiffen spines and choke smiles. Elliot watched as he yanked a phone from a young waitress's hands. She'd been showing a customer a photo of her newborn daughter. "Personal time is for personal calls," Jake snapped, loud enough for half the restaurant to hear. The girl's face flushed with embarrassment, and she murmured apologies to both Jake and the confused diner. That wasn't management. That was humiliation. Public discipline wrapped in ego. Then Elliot saw her. A young waitress gliding through the fire section with grace under pressure. Her name tag read Nia. There was something about her, her eyes steady, her movements intentional. She offered real smiles when Jake wasn't watching, helped an older man read the menu, answered questions with patience and sincerity. In a sea of fear, she was a flicker of resistance, of hope. Maya, the bartender, appeared with a practiced rhythm. Mid-40s, eyes lined with exhaustion but still carrying traces of kindness. "What can I get you started with?" she asked, masking weariness with a professional smile. "Just coffee," Elliot said softly. "And maybe you could recommend something from the lunch menu?" Her expression shifted, just for a moment, a spark of surprise at the courtesy, at being treated like a person. "The pasta special's solid today," she said, then leaned in a little. "But between you and me, stick with the classics. Some of the new stuff, well, not everything's as good as it used to be." And in that whisper, Elliot heard more than menu advice. He heard history unraveling, quiet truths wrapped in hospitality. Something had gone wrong, deeply wrong, and he wasn't leaving until he understood exactly how to make it right again. Maya's voice faltered mid-sentence, her eyes flicking nervously toward Jake, who was now unleashing a torrent of criticism at a server near the kitchen. The tension in her expression told Elliot all he needed to know. Honesty had become dangerous currency here. He gave a slight nod, signaling he understood. Even the bartender, who once might have taken pride in recommending a dish, was now too afraid to speak openly about the food she served. It was a stark contrast to the early days, when every employee had been an enthusiastic advocate for the menu, speaking passionately about ingredients and preparation, like artists showcasing their craft. Now, they walked the floor like dancers afraid to miss a step. The coffee arrived swiftly, and to Elliot's surprise, it was still exceptional. The same roast he had selected years ago after weeks of tastings. There was something bittersweet in that, a small flicker of the past refusing to be extinguished, but as he sipped and observed, his heart grew heavier. To the casual diner, the restaurant might have seemed functional, even busy, but to Elliot, the cracks were glaring. Servers moved with frantic urgency, as if being chased rather than guided. Their eyes darted between tables and the looming presence of Jake. Twice Elliot watched employees begin their mandated breaks, only to be summoned back by Jake for trivial errands, grabbing extra napkins, adjusting a thermostat. It wasn't efficiency, it was control masquerading as leadership. The tip jar at the bar, once overflowing during a lunch rush, looked pitifully light. Elliot remembered how it used to represent shared success, how the team celebrated when it filled quickly. But now, it mirrored the morale of the staff, depleted. When the pasta finally arrived, it was set down without a word by a server who practically fled the scene. No smile, no eye contact, no pride. Elliot looked at the plate. The presentation was careless, sauce sloppily pooled, vegetables scattered haphazardly, and when he took the first bite, his quiet plan of observation shattered. The pasta was undercooked, the sauce lukewarm, the vegetables still frozen at the core. This wasn't a matter of preference, it was a violation of everything Fork and Flame stood for. Standards had been erased, pride replaced by fear. He had built his brand on quality, consistency, care, and now, in the very restaurant that bore his vision, he was being served food that wouldn't pass muster in a roadside diner. He motioned to a nearby server. Not Nia, but a girl who looked like she should still be in high school. She approached slowly, already bracing herself. "Excuse me," Elliot said gently. "I think the pasta might need a little more time in the kitchen. It's still quite cold in the middle." But before she could reply, Jake materialized like a shadow summoned by criticism. His face was flushed, jaw tight, voice loud enough to silence half the room. "What's the problem now?" he barked, his tone sharpened to draw attention. Elliot kept his voice calm, low. I was just mentioning the pasta's undercooked. I thought the kitchen should know. But Jake escalated. Oh, here we go, he sneered. Another guy trying to scam a free lunch with a fake complaint. He leaned closer, contempt dripping from his voice. Let me guess. Want it comped? Maybe toss in a free dessert while we're at it? The dining room froze. Conversation stalled, forks paused midair. All eyes turned to the spectacle unfolding at the bar. The young server stood between them, eyes wide, caught in the crossfire. I'm happy to pay, Elliot said softly. I just thought the kitchen... We don't do second chances for cheapskates, Jake interrupted, practically shouting now. You don't like it? There's a McDonald's down the street. Finish what you ordered or get out. The words struck like hammers in the silence that followed. Customers looked away, uncomfortable. A few discreetly pulled out phones. The warmth that once filled Fork and Flame was gone, replaced by humiliation and hostility. For a moment, Elliot felt the impulse rise, 3 words burning on his tongue. Do you know who I am? But something stopped him. Maybe it was Nia, standing frozen across the room, her fists clenched at her sides, clearly fighting the urge to speak up. Maybe it was the realization that this wasn't just a bad day, this was the daily reality. Instead, Elliot reached into his wallet, laid down enough cash to cover the meal and a generous tip, even though he doubted it would reach the intended hands. Thank you for your time, he said quietly. He rose, spine straight despite the weight pressing on it. As he stepped away, Jake's voice trailed behind him like a sour echo. Next time, try Applebee's. More your speed. The forced laughter from Jake's loyal few chased him out the door. Elliot walked out into the sunlight, past the threshold of the dream he once nurtured, and felt something he hadn't in decades: failure. Not the financial kind. He'd weathered plenty of those. This was different. This was soul deep. He had failed his people, his promise, his name. He reached his car a block away, keys trembling slightly in his hands. It took 7 minutes to sit, breathe, and let the weight settle in his bones. But back inside the restaurant, those same 7 minutes were stirring something else. Jake, flush with false victory, strutted like a prize fighter, boasting to no one. That's how you handle freeloaders. You give 'em an inch. Next thing they're running the place. But the room didn't share his energy. Conversations resumed, but the ease was gone. 3 tables requested early checks. An elderly couple near the window kept stealing glances at the door, whispering in concern. Behind the bar, Maya was scrubbing glasses with unusual vigor, her jaw clenched. She had seen a lot in 15 years of bartending, but never a manager humiliate a guest so brutally over such a minor complaint, especially one that had merit. At table 12, Nia Holloway worked quietly, but her mind was racing. She'd watched everything. The confrontation, the poised restraint, the way Elliot had scanned the room like someone taking stock of something precious. And then there was the look in his eyes. Anguish, not outrage. Recognition, not rebellion. And she realized something no one else had. Elliot hadn't walked in as a customer. He had returned as the owner. Nia had watched the slow unraveling long enough to know this wasn't just mismanagement, it was sabotage in disguise. The changes had started when the new regional director took over and brought in Jake Monroe under the guise of tightening operations. But the coded language was transparent to those on the inside. Stronger profit margins and aggressive leadership were corporate euphemisms for one thing: strip the soul from the business in exchange for short-term number. Cut corners, squeeze every dollar, burn through staff and morale if needed. And Jake? He delivered spectacularly. In just 6 months, 12 team members had quit or been fired. Tip sharing, a symbol of camaraderie, had mutated into tip skimming, with Jake finding creative ways to funnel gratuities away from the servers and into managerial adjustments. Breaks were no longer rights. They became privileges Jake revoked at will. Quality food had given way to mass-produced mediocrity, as fresh ingredients were replaced by cheaper pre-packaged substitutes that could be microwaved faster and plated quicker. But the truth wasn't in the whispers. It was in the folder buried deep inside Naya's worn canvas tote bag. She hadn't started documenting because she intended to bring down an empire. She had done it because she needed to believe that someone would care, that if the right eyes ever saw what she'd seen, change might still be possible. It was a quiet rebellion, one built page by page. Printed emails showing Jake's orders to reduce portions, screenshots of schedules designed to keep employees just under full-time hours to avoid paying benefits, and written statements from co-workers let go for simply asking about missing wages or their right to take a legal break. But the most damning of all, altered customer feedback forms. Jake had been systematically rewriting complaint reports, flipping blame back onto the customers to make it seem like they were difficult or dishonest. In reality, they were simply reacting to the dysfunction he had normalized. Nia had tried to go through the proper channels. Twice she reported him to HR. Twice she was ignored. The regional office worshipped Jake's numbers. They didn't care how he got them. But today changed everything. Watching that soft-spoken man who carried himself with such gentle dignity be ridiculed and ejected over a simple, valid complaint was the final straw. But more than that, it was the moment of revelation. When Jake had shouted and Elliot reached for his wallet, a business card had slipped free. It had landed face up for just a heartbeat, but it was enough. The logo was unmistakable. Fork and Flame, and beneath it, printed in understated serif font, was the name every employee learned during onboarding, though few ever saw in real life. Elliot Crane, founder and CEO. He hadn't just been another customer, humiliated by Jake. He was the man who had built this place with his own hands, and had just been thrown out of it. 7 minutes. That's how long it had been since he walked out the door. He might still be nearby. Nia felt her heart kick against her chest as she glanced up at the clock. Her decision crystallized in an instant, less a plan and more a calling. She untied her apron with shaking fingers and turned to Maya. "I'm taking my break," she said, her voice tight with urgency. Maya nodded silently. She understood. She'd seen it too. The collapse, the cruelty, the way this place no longer resembled the dream it once was. Clutching her tote bag, its weight suddenly feeling immense, Nia pushed through the rear exit and sprinted around the building. Her feet pounded the pavement, lungs burning, but she didn't slow. Not until she spotted him. A block away, a figure moved slowly toward a modest silver sedan. Even from behind, she recognized the shoulders, slightly hunched, but holding on to dignity. She saw the hesitation in the hand reaching for the car door. "Sir," she called out, her voice cracking with urgency. "Please, wait." Elliot turned, startled, his brows furrowed at first in confusion, then softened in recognition. It was the young waitress, the one who had stood out from the crowd inside, the one who still carried pride in her work like it meant something. She reached him, breathless and flushed, eyes wide with emotion. "Please, don't leave. Not yet." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried something deeper than volume. Sincerity. Elliot let go of the door handle. Up close, she looked even younger. Mid-20s, maybe, but her eyes held a gravity beyond her years. Her name tag still clung to her shirt. Nia. She hugged her bag like it held her heart. "I'm sorry," she blurted, "for what happened in there. The way Jake treated you, it wasn't just wrong, it was disgraceful." Elliot gave her a sad, tired smile. "You don't have to apologize for someone else's behavior." "But I do," she said, stepping closer. Her voice dropped. Because I know who you are. The words landed like a weight across his chest. I'm sorry, what? When you pulled out your wallet, she said, steadier now. A card fell. I saw the logo. I saw the name. Elliot Crane. Silence expanded between them, filled only by the hum of distant traffic and the sound of a life's work teetering on the edge. I know I shouldn't have followed you, she added quickly, but I couldn't let you leave without telling you. This isn't what we are. This isn't what Fork and Flame was meant to be. For a long moment, Elliot didn't speak. He just looked at her, really looked, and in her eyes he saw something he hadn't seen in a long time. Belief. Not just in him, but in the ideals he thought the world had given up on. How long have you known? He asked quietly. About you, 7 minutes, she said, but about what's happening inside that restaurant, 3 years. She shifted the bag in her arms, and a thick manila folder peeked out. Elliot's eyes narrowed, curious. What's in the bag? Nia straightened. Proof. Everything Jake's been doing. How he's stealing tips, denying breaks, falsifying records, manipulating hours. Everything corporate doesn't want to deal with because he looks good on paper. She pulled the folder out and held it toward him, her hands trembling slightly. I kept it all. Emails, statements, schedules. I filed 2 HR complaints. They said he was performing and I was just failing to adapt. Tears shimmered at the edge of her voice, not from sadness, but from the weight of holding all of this alone for too long. And for the first time since he stepped through the doors of his old restaurant, Elliot Crane felt something flicker inside him. Not shame, not regret. Resolve. Elliot stared at the folder, his fingers brushing the edges of the thick documentation. Proof of something sick and systemic, growing under the name he had once protected with everything he had. His throat tightened. He'd spent years building Fork and Flame into something that stood for care, integrity, and excellence. And now, under his very nose, it had been twisted into a place of exploitation. Why? He asked quietly. Why did you keep all this? HR didn't listen, management didn't care. Why keep fighting? Nia's face shifted, some of the steel in her expression melting into something softer, something raw. Because I remember, she said, voice trembling just slightly. I remember what this place used to be like. Before Jake. Before everything got cold. She glanced back toward the restaurant, her eyes flickering with memory. When Carol was the manager, she knew everyone's name. She asked about our families. She made sure we had real breaks. She cared about the food, about the guests, about us. We felt like we were part of something worth protecting. What happened to Carol? Elliot asked, though he already feared the answer. Restructured out, Nia said, her words bitter with understanding. 6 months ago, they said she wasn't profit-focused enough. That's when Jake got promoted from assistant manager. That's when everything started to fall apart. Elliot took the folder from her, feeling more than just its physical weight. He felt the weight of decisions he hadn't made but had allowed to happen through his silence. This wasn't just documentation. It was a mirror, reflecting back the cost of his absence. You could lose your job for this, he said, meeting her gaze. If Jake finds out, I probably already have, she admitted with a strained laugh. Running out after the man Jake just humiliated? Not exactly subtle, but I can't keep quiet, Mr. Crane. I can't keep pretending this is okay. I can't serve food I'm ashamed of for a man who treats people like they're replaceable. He straightened, and in that moment Elliot saw in her the very traits that had once driven him to build Fork and Flame from a dusty corner bistro into a household name. Integrity, guts, and the courage to risk everything for something that mattered more. I'd rather lose my job doing what's right, she said, then keep it by staying silent about what's wrong. Your restaurant, it used to mean something. It still could, but only if someone's willing to care enough to fix it. Standing in the parking lot of his own legacy, Elliot Crane felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Fire. Not rage. Purpose. "Would you walk back in there with me?" he asked, voice firm, not as an employee reporting to Jake, but as my eyes, my guide, someone who can show me exactly what's broken. For the first time since she'd sprinted into the alley, Nia smiled. A real smile. One that reached her eyes. "Mr. Crane," she said, "I thought you'd never ask." Their return walk to the restaurant felt different. No longer retreat. This was reclamation. Elliot wasn't a bystander anymore. He was coming back to claim what he'd once built, and what he had, unknowingly, allowed to be betrayed. Before stepping through the door, he paused and gestured to the folder. "Before we go in, I need to see it all." They moved just out of view from the windows, and Nia opened the folder, page after page, each one a wound. The first section laid bare the labor manipulation, screenshots of scheduling software revealing how Jake kept employees at 39 hours a week, just below the benefits threshold. But even worse, the timestamps showed Jake had been calling them in for extra off-the-record emergency shifts. "Sarah Martinez?" Nia said quietly, pointing to one screenshot. "Single mom. He schedules her for 39 hours, then calls her in last minute? If she says no, he threatens to cut her core hours, calls it team disloyalty." Elliot clenched his jaw. This wasn't oversight, it was calculated abuse. The next section, tip jar photos. The numbers were gut-wrenching. At 6 p.m. on a bustling Friday night, the jar was overflowing. $200, 0 cents easy. But at closing time, barely $85, 0 cents remained. "Maya started documenting this when she noticed the pattern," Nia explained. "Jake has the key, comes by multiple times during a shift. Is stealing from them," Elliot murmured. Then came the altered customer complaints. Dozens. The originals, calm, reasonable grievances about undercooked meals, slow service, even a hair in a child's food, had all been rewritten in Jake's hand to frame customers as scammers, freeloaders, or troublemakers. "He's been doing it for months," Nia said, her voice edged with anger. "He rewrites the narrative to protect himself, so corporate thinks we have bad customers, not a broken system." And finally, the most devastating section, testimonies from former employees. Marcus, fired for attitude after challenging the use of expired produce. Jennifer, accused of theft after asking about her tips. David, dismissed for insubordination after seating a customer Jake didn't want to serve. "I met with them after they were fired," Nia said. "They were scared to go public. Jake told them if they spoke out, he'd blacklist them from every restaurant in the region." Elliot's hands trembled as he closed the folder. His stomach churned, not from doubt, but from the terrible clarity of knowing. Jake Monroe hadn't just mismanaged his restaurant. He had waged war against its soul. "There's one more thing," Nya said. She pulled out her phone, opened the voice recorder app, and pressed play. Jake's voice spilled into the air, smug, arrogant. "Yeah, the numbers look great because I streamlined operations, cut the dead weight, stopped pampering customers looking for freebies. Staff complaints? Just some whiners who couldn't handle real leadership." The call continued with Jake boasting about how he'd turned Fork and Flame into a lean, profitable machine by eliminating soft policies and coddling. Elliot stood in stunned silence. The man inside that restaurant wasn't a manager. He was a virus. "Naya," Elliot said slowly, carefully. "Whatever happens next, you're safe. You have my word. You've shown more integrity in the last 10 minutes than anyone in my management chain has in years." She nodded, understanding what was about to unfold. "So, what's the plan?" Elliot looked at the folder, then at the building. Through the window, Jake was holding court near the bar, his posture smug, probably retelling the story of the customer he just humiliated. "We're going to walk in there," Elliot said, "and I'm going to introduce myself properly, not as a diner, not as some stranger, but as the man who built this place, and the man who is about to hold everyone accountable." He tucked the folder under his arm, stood tall, and pushed open the door. The bell chimed. But this time, it didn't sound like a welcome. It sounded like reckoning. The dining room hushed. Customers turned. Whispers rippled. Near the bar, Jake Monroe leaned on a stool, still laughing, still unaware. And Elliot Crane took his first step back into the world he'd created. To reclaim it. To rebuild it. To make it right. Jake was leaning against the bar, mid-sentence, animatedly bragging to two visibly uncomfortable servers when the door opened behind him. He looked up, expecting another late customer, only to see Elliot walk back in, not alone this time, but with Nia at his side. His reaction was instant and loud. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," Jake said, his voice once again dripping with contempt. "What part of leave didn't you understand?" Then he spotted Nia beside Elliot. His eyes narrowed into slits. "And your break ended 10 minutes ago. Get back to your tables." But Nia didn't flinch. She didn't look away or slink off like she might have once. She stood rooted beside Elliot, chin lifted, spine straight. No longer just a waitress, but a witness. Other staff began to take notice. Maya behind the bar paused, her cleaning rag motionless. The servers Jake had been speaking to stiffened. Even the kitchen staff, curious about the sudden shift in atmosphere, peered out from behind the service window. Elliot spoke, calm but clear. "I think we need to have a conversation, all of us." Jake's flush deepened. "Listen, buddy, I already told you." "My name," Elliot cut in, "is Elliot Crane." The words fell like thunder in the room. Silence followed. Complete. Several phones came out, customers sensing they were witnessing something remarkable. Jake stumbled over his next breath. It's impossible. You're just some homeless guy trying to score a free lunch. The CEO doesn't look like..." "Like what?" Elliot asked quietly, eyes locked on Jake. "Like someone who'd show up in person to check on their people? Like someone who still cares about the culture they built?" He held up the folder. Jake's eyes locked on it, and the mask began to crack. "Nia's been documenting some very troubling patterns," Elliot said, voice growing stronger. "Would you care to explain why tip money consistently vanishes during your shifts? Or why long-term staff have been terminated for simply asking about their rights?" "He's lying," Jake snapped, voice rising in desperation. "She's just bitter, a disgruntled employee." "Are you in the gym?" Ilias said coldly, flipping the folder open. Screenshots with timestamps showing you manipulated schedules to avoid benefits while calling people in for unrecorded shifts. Gasps echoed through the room. Staff began edging closer, faces darkening as understanding settled in. Elliot pulled out the next set of documents, photos of the tip jar's contents across shifts, matched with register logs. "Care to explain these?" he asked, lifting them up. "Maya took them. She noticed the inconsistencies." Jake's bravado faltered. "This is harassment." Elliot's voice turned sharp. "No, this is accountability." He held up more papers. "Falsified complaint reports. You rewrote customer complaints, Jake. Turned legitimate concerns into lies. Accused people of planting hair in their food. Blamed them for your failures." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence was suffocating, and then Elliot nodded to Nia. She pressed play on her phone. Jake's own voice rang out, smug and self-congratulatory, bragging to the regional director about cutting the dead weight and stopping handouts to problem customers. The recording went on, damning in its clarity. When it ended, the silence wasn't just heavy, it was suffused with realization. The truth had finally been spoken. "That's illegal," Jake shouted, grasping at straws. "You can't use that." "Actually," Elliot replied, calm as ever, "this state only requires one-party consent, and Nia, as part of the workplace, had every right." Jake looked around one last time, but there were no allies left, just employees he'd demeaned and customers who had seen behind his curtain. "Jake Monroe," Elliot said, voice like steel. "You're fired. Effective immediately. Security will escort you off the premises. HR will contact you regarding theft, fraud, and labor violations." Jake opened his mouth, but no sound came. The swagger that once filled every room with tension was gone. All that remained was a man, exposed by his own cruelty. "Maya," Elliot said, turning to the bartender, "please call security." Then he turned to Nia, the one who had sparked it all. "Would you help me address the staff? We've got some rebuilding to do." As Jake was escorted out, the restaurant stirred, like something had broken open, not in a bad way, in a way that allowed light to finally enter. Applause began, first from customers, then from staff. Hope buzzed in the air, like oxygen returning to a suffocating room. For the first time in a long time, Fork and Flame felt alive. 3 weeks later, Elliot sat in the corner booth he'd once been denied. He sipped from a coffee cup that tasted richer than it had in years. Not because the beans had changed, but because the atmosphere had. The windows sparkled with light. The energy in the room had shifted from guarded to genuine. Staff moved freely, smiling without fear. And customers lingered, not out of obligation, but joy. The first week had been tough. Chaos, questions, corporate panic, but Elliot hadn't stepped back. He'd stayed. He rolled up his sleeves and stood beside his people, asked their names, heard their stories, and made real change. The break room had been painted yellow, Nia's suggestion. Bright and warm, it set the tone for everything else. New chairs replaced broken ones. A bulletin board now celebrated birthdays, milestones, and customer compliments. Tip sharing returned to full transparency, managed by Maya, now the assistant manager. Schedules went up 2 weeks in advance. Full-time hours were honored. Breaks respected. Most importantly, the food was good again. Real food. Fresh. Local ingredients. Generous portions. Elliot had returned to the kitchen, not as a boss, but as a partner, working shoulder to shoulder with the team. The couple who'd seen Jake's outburst, they'd returned, twice, bringing friends and praising the miracle turnaround. Sarah Martinez was now a senior server with full benefits. The 3 employees Jake had wrongfully fired, 2 were back, with apologies and back pay. The 3rd had moved on, but thanked Elliot for the gesture. Maya's leadership had bloomed. Her operational tweaks had already improved service without compromising quality. Elliot was mentoring her for bigger things. But it was Nia who stunned him most. When he offered her a promotion, she asked instead to create an employee advocacy program to protect staff in every Fork and Flame location. "There are other Jakes out there," she'd said. "Let's make sure they can't do this again." He made her his direct mentee, and she in turn insisted on keeping shifts at the restaurant. So I never forget what it's like out here. Now, watching her move with quiet authority, Elliot saw everything Fork and Flame was meant to be. Not in policies, not in profits, but in people. The new plaque near the door was her idea. It read, "Integrity is what you do when no one is watching. NH." It sparked conversation, inspired pride, anchored the culture in something real. Elliot's phone buzzed. Record high customer satisfaction, near zero staff turnover. Corporate wanted him to replicate this transformation company-wide. But he smiled, knowing what they couldn't put in a manual: the truth. This success had begun with one brave voice. Nia appeared at his table, coffee pot in hand. "Liefel," she grinned. "Please," he said, lifting his cup. "And Nia, thank you for everything." She topped it off, glanced around at the thriving restaurant, then looked back at him. "No," she said, smiling with quiet pride. "Thank you for remembering what this place was supposed to be." As she moved off to help another table, Elliot raised his coffee in silent salute. The flame at Fork and Flame was burning bright again, not just from fire in the kitchen, but from the hearts of people who chose to do what was right when it mattered most. And it all began with a waitress who refused to let injustice have the final word.